So today's webinar is entitled Informing Climate Change Adaptation Planning for the Gondwana Rainforests of Australia World Heritage Area. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which all of us work and live. I'm personally broadcasting from Canberra today, so I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I acknowledge their deep understanding of our ecologically and culturally valuable lands, oceans and unique species, including those which are found within our World Heritage areas within Australia. And I recognise their knowledge of the management and care practices which can result in a more sustainable system within our ecological and culturally valuable areas. I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. In today's webinar, we have two presenters joining us today. Our first presenter is Melinda Laidlaw. Melinda is a senior ecologist at the Queensland Department of Environment and Science, where she leads the decision tools for predicting current and future species habitat project. Melinda also investigates the impacts of climate change on the Gondwana Rainforests of Australia World Heritage Area. Our second speaker for today is Sugata Narsey. Sugata is a research scientist at the Bureau of Meteorology, working on topics in climate change, variability and extremes. Sugata works collaboratively with Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub stakeholders and next users to develop practical climate change science information that can be used to inform future planning and decision making. So those are our two speakers today, and we'll be starting first off with Melinda. So Mel, I'll pass over to you to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sonia, and thanks everybody for coming along today. Today we're going to present some information of a collaboration we've been working on for the last 18 months. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors for the report, so Sugata, my co-speaker, Rob Coleman from Bureau of Meteorology, Karen Pearce, Mandy Hopkins from CSIRO and Andrew Dowdy also from the Bureau of Meteorology, and also the many field volunteers who've helped make this project come together. So just to give you some background of the World Heritage Area, the Gondwana World Heritage Area is quite unique in that it is a serial property. So there's 40 reserves which make up the World Heritage Area, and they extend from northern New South Wales into southeast Queensland, crossing the state boundary. There's a diversity of rainforest communities as well as other vegetation types within the World Heritage Area, but one of the defining characters of the World Heritage Area is the conservation of high elevation rainforest communities. And these communities are quite unique in that they are a link to our heritage. They contain many ancient lineages of plants and animals. They're a repository for many endemic species, and they are a biodiversity hotspot within Australia. They're also a source of many new species, and a lot of research is turning up new flora and fauna species all the time in these very unique and biodiverse areas. Now, one of the reasons why it supports such high levels of biodiversity is we have mountain ranges captured within the World Heritage Area fairly close to the coast, and as a result there is a wide range of microhabitats captured. There's also a variability in soils as well. So really we have perfect conditions to really drive biodiversity within the World Heritage Area. And one of the forest types of particular interest to me are the high elevation communities which have a dependence on water inputs from clouds. So right up on the border between Queensland and New South Wales is a landmark called the Mount Warning or Twig caldera. So the state border runs along the northern flanks of the caldera. And this is an area very close to the Gold Coast and to Brisbane, so it's an area where quite a lot of research into biodiversity has been done. But back in 2006, I became involved in a project that was actually run by Griffith University and through Roger Kitching's laboratory. And this was to have a look at the impacts of altitude on driving biodiversity around the world. So this is just one of many transects that are distributed up the Queensland coast into Papua New Guinea and Southeast Asia and the like. But the Ibisca Queensland project was established on the northern flanks of the Mount Warning caldera back in 2006, and at that time the Queensland Herbarium was lucky to be involved in establishing the vegetation plots there. So the reasons for using these elevational transects is to try and detect changes in biodiversity that are linked to climatic differences. So the climatic range that is covered in an elevational transect from 300 metres up to 1100 metres, there's quite a degree of temperature variation along that transect, and also a wide range of rainfall as well, rainfall gradient. So by establishing a transect such as this on the side of mountains, we can use that as a surrogate for monitoring climate change impacts right now. Okay, so we established vegetation plots to try and assess whether we could detect some kind of upslope movement in the vegetation community. That's one of the predicted changes that may occur, particularly with a warming climate, but climate change in general. And we actually found something quite a bit different. Rather than a stepwise upslope movement, we found there was a very distinct cutoff at around between 700 and 900 metres of elevation. So you can see from this graph here, we've got plant communities in the high elevation forests where the established tree community and the juvenile community really resembled each other very closely. If we come slightly down slope again, we found that same pattern. So there was a lot of overlap between the parent tree community and the juvenile tree community. But below, around from 700 metre plots and below, we actually found that there was a disentangling between the two different communities, and we actually had quite a separate juvenile tree community from the established tree community. And that's not something that we expected to find, and it took quite a bit of thinking about what might be causing this. And one of the features of the high elevation forests within the World Heritage Area is the common incursion of cloud or fog into the forest. And you can tell from the different life forms that grow at high elevation, when you've entered that zone, because there are many mosses and lichens and the like hanging from the trees, and they're utilising that cloud water and capturing that. So fortunately for us, work had already been done on the inputs of cloud water by the University of Queensland at a national park, which was an area of rainforest just to the west of where we were working. In that study, they found that around 40% of the cloud water, 40% of the moisture budget of that forest was actually coming from cloud water and not from rain that you could capture in a rain gauge. And we thought that maybe this is something that we need to investigate in terms of impacting the patterns that we are seeing. Now, you can quite regularly see clouds sitting on top of the mountains across the whole caldera, but how do you actually quantify that, and is it generalisable? Approximately 8 years ago, I started to deploy some cloud catching weather stations to try and work out at what elevation this cloud water is likely to be kicking in and maybe impacting the structure of the vegetation community and the diversity. So along the Ibisca transect, which we established in 2006, from 700 metres to 1100 metres, I have 6 cloud capturing weather stations set up. So these are just tipping bucket rain gauges, and they have a stainless steel mesh screen attached to the top of them to try and harvest cloud water. They also have a lid in an effort to try and exclude rainfall. There's other ways we can take rainfall data out. But yeah, so this is currently still running on the hillside at Lamington National Park on the northern side of the Mount Warning caldera. But this certainly was proving quite problematic in getting data that may be able to link what we're seeing in the vegetation community to what's happening in the cloud layer. Rainforests are really quite harsh environments, and it's not uncommon to come back and find that spiders or other insects have moved into the mechanism and meant that that has not been triggering fog or a cloud event. And quite often they're very vulnerable to tree falls as well. So it's quite an expensive piece of machinery and quite heartbreaking to come and find that a large branch has come down and crushed it. So while we had some information that indicates that it's likely these high elevation communities are getting a lot of their precipitation from cloud water, we really couldn't say what was happening definitively, and certainly not on a scale that would be of any use to management or protecting these unique and biodiverse environments into the future. So we really needed a little bit of help. Now, we knew quite a lot already. We knew that the Gondwana Rainforest of Australia World Heritage Area supports some of the most extensive and biodiverse forests in the world. And we knew that it was likely that anthropogenic climate change was leading to increasing moisture stress within the forests. And research that we had done via this IBISCA transect suggested that the high elevation cloud forest communities are reliant on moisture from low level cloud and fog, and it was likely they were particularly reliant during the dry season when moisture stress was at its highest. So tree community turnover in these rainforests appeared from our data that it might be being mitigated at high elevation by inputs from this cloud water. Now, it did make attempts to try and get data for cloud by getting data from nearby airports, and as you can tell from our experiments, some field measurements, but unfortunately that data is really not generalisable. So the knowledge gap for us that was really quite a barrier to us moving forward with this research was how are moisture inputs from low cloud influencing flora and fauna distributions now, so what patterns can we see now, and what are the likely impacts going to be into the future. And we'd also really like to be able to use climate change information when we're thinking about adaptation planning for the World Heritage Area. So that's when this project came together. So our executive officer for the World Heritage Committees, Trish Waters, saw me give a presentation at a rainforest conference and came to discuss whether this might be a project where we could engage the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub to address the question via a case study. So the first step was to get everybody together and have a chat about what the problems were, what the data availability was, and what might be a course of action moving forward. What could we actually achieve? So we met together with a group of experts in Brisbane 18 months ago to actually hone down what the problem was. So from my perspective, I didn't know exactly what it was about the cloud water that I needed to measure, but fortunately having experts from the Bureau of Meteorology around the table, it helped us establish that it was actually the cloud height that we needed, so the lifting condensation level. So this kind of led to a lot of us getting together with expertise in various areas, so some in management from national parks, some from knowledge brokering, meteorology, ecology, and then just people who are excellent connectors to help us find the answers that we need to find. So that meant that we could then work together, define the problem, nut out our data, and then synthesize it into something that hopefully will have meaning for management for this World Heritage Area going forward. And the report that has resulted from this is out and available online now, Understanding the Impact of Climate Change on Cloud Forests in the Gondwana World Heritage Area. So that's the process as to how we came up with the question and how we went to get the data together. So now I'm going to hand over to my co-author, Sugata, who's going to tell us about the work that he's done from a Bureau of Meteorology perspective.
Thanks, Mel. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me for a second. Mel, can you tell me if you can see that?
Yep, it's all good.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so thanks for that, Mel. I'll probably focus up, well, I will focus much more on the climate aspect of this project, but I'd like to acknowledge all the contributors to this project, especially Mel, who has really been the driving force in many ways. And to set the context for everything I'm going to talk about now, I thought I'd just show this plot. This is the annual mean temperature anomaly for Eastern Australia for the last 100 or so years. And the red bars represent warmer than average conditions, and the blue bars represent cooler than average conditions compared to the 1961 to 1990 average. And so you can see here that there has been a steady march upwards in annual mean temperature over the last 100 or so years. And that black line there is the 10-year running mean, and you can see there's dips here and there, and so these things, these rises and dips over short term represent things like the influence of the El Nino and La Nina years. But in general, the climate has been changing, and this is we know is largely due to the influence of human-induced warming from greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the background, that's the context for everything I'm going to talk about now. So I describe this project from my perspective as climate science meets ecology. And really the way that I see what happened here is that experts in the local climate and the very special habitat in the Gondwana Rainforest have identified a climate-related problem. And experts here are referred to Mel, who's my co-presenter and pictured here. And so challenge 0 is to find and connect the right expertise. And that's, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But the part that I've worked on, I call here challenge 1, which is to quantitatively estimate climate variables of interest for this particular area. And then the next challenge, of course, is to translate that new knowledge of climate science into really practical information that will go on to inform adaptation planning and decision-making for the region. So that's really what ultimately we want to get out of the science that's being done in these projects. And really the key innovation in this project, I would say, is the connection between different branches of science in order to try and achieve some kind of impact that will be really meaningful. And so connecting people is a critical step, and I'm going to embarrass a couple of people here. Tricia Waters, who Mel already name dropped, and Mandy Hopkins in particular, who is a knowledge broker and now program manager for the Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub. Between the two of them, they've really driven sort of the background of getting this project together, connecting people and making sure that we're all getting in the same room and on the same page towards a common goal of achieving the outcomes that we want. And of course, none of this could happen without having some sort of scientific expertise, and people are really enthusiastic about doing the work. So acknowledging here climate scientists Joe Brown and Rob Coleman at the Bureau, and ecologists Mel in particular, and knowledge brokers Karen Pierce, who helped us pull all the information together and try and make it salient for decision makers and put together information for a report that would achieve that. So what this project really is about is moisture stress. And here I'm showing a graph of the annual cycle of temperature, that's the green dots there, and rainfall, which is these bars underneath. And you can see that around August, September, so in the cool season, it's also the dry season. And that's time when low clouds on the ranges keep the forest alive by basically condensing water directly on the surfaces. And the question at hand is, how might climate change affect that sort of moisture stress during those dry months? So excuse my dodgy little cartoon here, but some processes to think about. Moisture stress really occurs when the net input of moisture is insufficient. And so one way of thinking about that is, how do these trees on the transect or up the slope receive water? Well, they receive water from rain, and they also receive water from these passing low clouds. So you can imagine what Mel has described. If you put a screen up and a cloud passes by, you don't have to wait for the water to fall out as rain. You can actually just collect it by letting that condensate hit the screen. And that's essentially what these trees on the landscape do. And of course, then you have outputs like evapotranspiration. I haven't listed others here, but runoff and base flow. So key factors are temperature, rainfall, relative humidity, wind, and the height of these clouds. So here in my dodgy cartoon, you can imagine if the clouds were to be slightly higher, then the net input of moisture would be a little bit less. And so you'd go out of balance, and suddenly you'd be in higher moisture stress. So that's the key question at hand here. And I'll really mostly focus on cloud base height during the driest part of the year, which is around those cool months, sort of August, September. Well, September here for the purpose of this talk. So this is a slide provided courtesy of Rob Coleman. Thanks, Rob. Showing a little schematic of what happens when clouds form or cloud caps form on high topography. So you can imagine this airflow from left to right. There's nowhere for this air to go. It can only go up, it can't go down. And so as it's pushed up, the temperature drops and water vapor starts to condense. And that height at which the clouds start to form, and I'm sure you've all seen this, including in that picture that Mel just showed, the clouds don't start randomly from different heights every 5 or 10 meters. They tend to start at a single height and you have this cloud base. And that's the level that we're concerned about today. I'm going to call that the lifting condensation level, or the LCL. So we can estimate cloud base height using a well-established empirical formula for the lifting condensation, or LCL, or lifting condensation level, sorry. And this is a proxy for cloud base height. So imagine, I'm gonna give you a little bit of a very brief atmospheric science lesson. Please bear with me. This is called parcel theory, and it's been really well established and well used for a very, very long time. So imagine lifting a parcel of air from the surface of the ground. And as it rises, it starts to cool. And at some height, the water vapor in that parcel will start to condense into liquid droplets, forming a cloud. So you can see this if you just look out your window right now, you'll see that there's clouds and they're all forming around the same height. It doesn't mean that there's no water vapor below it. It just means that that height you've started to condense into liquid droplets. So that's the LCL. So there's your cloud forming, and the bottom of it is the lifting condensation level. And it turns out you can estimate this quantity pretty well just using surface variables like temperature and humidity. So I'm going to show you some results for this from global climate models. And global climate models are I guess, the best tool that we have available to us as climate scientists to try and understand how the physical world will change under different future scenarios. So for example, if you were to increase greenhouse gases or decrease them, what will happen to all the conditions on the surface of the Earth? And the wonderful thing about this is that this information, which is state-of-the-art and run at massive expense by research institutions all over the world, this information is freely available to us, basically to anyone with an internet connection. So first, a brief detour into what climate models can tell us about the future, or what they do tell us about the future. In this figure, courtesy of David Crowley, I showed two future worlds under different emission scenarios. So on the left, if we have low emissions, and on the right, if we have a high emission scenario, how will surface temperature change in different places? And you can see here that climate models essentially predict that you'll have greater warming over the land regions than the oceans. So you can see here over the land, it's a bit more red than over the ocean, and it's the same for the left plot. And also at higher latitude, so you can see up here in the Arctic, for example, very dramatic changes. And the other part of this, another part of this to think about, is how the water cycle changes in response to climate change, and in response to greenhouse gas induced warming. And you can see here that the water cycle changes are not going to be uniform. So unlike temperature, which pretty much goes up everywhere, a little bit more in some places than others, precipitation or rainfall doesn't change in the same way. So some parts of the world, rainfall might get heavier, and some parts of the world, rainfall might get less. But and it's highly uncertain, and climate models don't agree on this. And that's the kind of research question that drives people like me. It's what I do day to day. But one thing we could say is that the contrast in precipitation between wet and dry regions and wet and dry seasons is probably going to increase, which is a slightly worrying thing. Okay, so now to take this down to a more regional scale. So we've given you the big picture of climate model projections for the future. This is an estimate of changes to cloud base height, using those state-of-the-art climate models. And you can see here, particularly, these are 4 different seasons for a high emission scenario in the future. I'll just bring your attention to the rightmost plot here. You can see that over land, it's mostly red. So that's suggesting that the base of clouds, the height of cloud base is going to rise in the future over land. And over the water, you can see here to the east in the Coral Sea, actually a drop in cloud base height. So that's suggesting that clouds might actually be lower, closer to the water surface. So there's this very strong gradient between the ocean and the land in the Australian region. And while this suggests for areas like the Tweed caldera, so that's marked there with the purple cross there, that obviously that's over land. Because we're in this transition zone between the land and the ocean, we're very near the coast, these coarse global climate models are highly uncertain for that area. So what do we do about that? Well, global climate models are the best tool we have, like I said, but they're not good for all things. So they're really good at understanding the large scale changes. Is this continent going to get drier or wetter? Is this big swath of the ocean going to get drier or wetter, hotter, etc.? That's great. But representation of small scale processes is just impossible in these global climate models because it would be prohibitively expensive to run. People are trying, but it'd be prohibitively expensive to run at the moment. And so, climate model information is at the sort of 100 to 200 kilometer scale. And climate features near sharp topography, so if you're on the side of a mountain range, for example, are not very well represented. Small regional scale circulations such as sea breezes are not very well represented. So here we have ecology of interest essentially on high topography in a coastal zone. It's going to be a challenge for a global climate model to accurately represent what's going on there. And that brings me to the next part of what we did here, which is to try to go to a finer scale, interpret these climate model results at a finer scale. We go to something called dynamical downscaling. Now, dynamical downscaling is perhaps the state-of-the-art way to take these global simulations and translate them into a local area of interest. And one way you can think about it, this is a slide courtesy of Michael Gross from CSIRO. One way to think about this is to try and get more megapixels out of your photograph, for example. That might sound crazy, but if you knew something about what's going on at the finer scales, maybe you could do that. And so that's what is done with dynamical downscaling models. You take these coarse GCMs, so here in this picture, this is saying around 150 kilometers, and then you run another model for a limited area using that global model as your kind of boundary conditions, right? The global model outputs. And so you just go to finer and finer scales, and these are really expensive to run, as you can imagine. They're very similar models to global climate models, except that they're run for a limited area. And so, of course, resources are an issue. How many of these can you run before you run out of money and run out of time? So is downscaling a silver bullet? Well, they provide added value, like I said, in areas where climate models may be limited, but they also introduce uncertainty as well. So that's a little caveat that, downscaling is very expensive to do. And so you also have to make some choices. You can only run perhaps a few models for a few of the global models. You can't run a regional model for every global model. It might be too expensive. So you have to make some choices, and that in itself introduces some biases, for example. So that's a little caveat. But fortunately for us, in this project, we wouldn't have had the resources to do these types of experiments. But fortunately for us, there are other projects in existence that we've been able to leverage. And I just described them here. The NARCLIN project, which is a New South Wales state government project. New South Wales and ACT regional climate modeling project. They downscaled climate models from the CMIP3 archive. So these are also state-of-the-art global climate models, but just from the previous generation. And those cover New South Wales and parts of Queensland. And then there's also the Queensland Future Climate Project, which downscales CMIP5 models for Queensland and part of New South Wales, and that's a Queensland government-funded project. So these ensembles don't completely agree, but I'm going to focus on the Queensland Future Climate Project results, partly because because they are for newer models. So the CMIP5 archive is a newer set of models, and also because they downscale more models than in the NARCLIM project, which had 4, whereas Queensland Future Climate had 11. So I can come back to that later if anyone's interested. But these are just some results. I'll talk a little bit about the actual results from these experiments. So we go ahead and estimate the lifting condensation level, or the cloud base height, from all these downscale projections simulations. And again, red colors here indicate a rise in cloud base height. And so these are all individual models, and then circled here on the bottom right is the ensemble mean, so the average of all the models. And you can see here that over land, in general, cloud base height seems to be going up. So that would indicate greater moisture stress, even in that coastal zone, right up to the coast. Temperature. It would be unsurprising to all of you on this call that temperature almost uniformly goes up in all these areas. And as found for global climate models, it tends to go up higher over land. So the land warms up more than the surrounding water. Rainfall. Rainfall is I guess the thing that we're all trying to find out more about, that is so important for everything that we care about. Yet it's one of the things that is most poorly understood in climate change simulation. So climate models tend to disagree about rainfall changes, and there's not a huge disagreement here in this Queensland Future Climate archive, but you can see that, yeah, there are some models that become wetter in some places and some that become drier in some places. But overall, on average, these models agree that there'll be a slight drying in the region. I should say as well, sorry, these figures I'm showing are all for the month of September, which is the month that we're most interested in for moisture stress for the Gondwana rainforests. These results may be different at other times of the year. And relative humidity. So I'm showing all these fields because they're things of interest to moisture stress. And relative humidity, again, for the Queensland Future Climate ensemble, in general, decreases over land. So you can see here that there are some models where it doesn't decrease strongly, and those are the models that perhaps have a slight increase in rainfall. But in general, relative humidity declines over land, and that's really consistent with theory as well, in terms of theory for climate change over large continental land masses. And so a small caveat before I get towards the end, which is that the choice of global climate model that you downscale is really, really important. I'm sorry, I know I'm really into the weeds here, into the details, but this is kind of an important caveat that if you looked at the Queensland Future Climate downscaling projections, they tend to show quite a clear and consistent message. But if you looked at the NARCLIM downscaling experiments, you'd see that there are actually some where the cloud base height actually drops over land in that coastal region. And actually 3 out of the 4 models that they downscaled, that's true. And I'll just point out one difference here. The Queensland Future Climate ensemble downscales 11 different GCMs, whereas the NARCLIM ensemble, even though there are 12 runs, there are actually only 4 GCMs, and you can see the similarity here between these triplets. And so the choice of your GCM is really important. These NARCLIM experiments, I guess, were chosen to represent the range of projections, but it's difficult to interpret that in a probabilistic sense about the likely outcomes in the future. So the more GCMs you can downscale, the closer you can come to giving that kind of probabilistic description. Nevertheless, these are different, I guess, storylines of how the future climate may change. All right, so a little summary of that climate information. I'm sorry, I went rapid fire through that. Human-induced warming will lead to higher surface temperatures, and likely this will lead to lower relative humidity, higher cloud base height, and greater moisture stress in the Gondwana Rainforest World Heritage Area. These conclusions are based on a combination of global climate model projections, as well as downscaling projections, model evaluation, and process understanding. Really importantly, we need to try and connect these things to theory. And so some caution has to has to be placed here because there are disagreements between these ensembles. But I think this is kind of a good reflection of uncertainty in GCM projections overall. So we shouldn't let this hamper us. I think this is useful information to send forward to next users, such as Mel, who will use these things for things like ecological modeling to help plan for the future. And I'll end on this cautionary tale, which I think neatly sums up my experience with this project, which is, here's a problem that someone has been struggling with, in this case, Mel, for nearly 2 decades now. And here we come along with our algorithms and our data sets and say, let's solve this for you, no problem. And 6 months later, or in this case, 18 months later, here we are. And this is a really hard problem, but hopefully we've made some progress towards this and will lead to good outcomes or useful outcomes for decision makers in the future. So with that, I'll end and hand back over to Mel.
I'm just going to now just talk a bit about scaling that down to what it's actually telling us about our research and how we can use this information to try and answer the questions that we have. Okay, so on a plot scale, when we actually look at our transect and we try to assess, answer some of the questions about, for example, seasonal variation in lifting condensation level along our study transect, the data that we're provided as a result of this project allowed us to see that there is likely to be cloud movement up and down the mountainsides in between seasons. There was some variation between the different ensembles that we studied, but essentially during the dry season, when the forest is already under moisture stress from low levels of rainfall, the cloud level is also lifting high up on the mountain range as well. So this is contributing additional moisture stress because it's not getting that mitigating impact at high to mid elevations. So for us to actually be able to see this in the data is really quite a game changer. It was something that we could just guess at before, but now to actually be able to see it, we can really start to refine our questions and even come up with new ones to investigate in the forest. Also looking forward to the projections as to what is likely to happen for community composition in the Gondwana World Heritage Area. This is really important for our management planning. What is it that we are likely to need to do moving into the future? So without having this data from Sugata and the rest of the project collaborators, we wouldn't be able to even start addressing these questions. So for example, we can see for the current time period, the cloud level predicted from the data we've been provided really does coincide with the patterns that we're seeing in the vegetation community. So it does appear that there is a mid-elevation cutoff where the lifting condensation level is contributing additional moisture to the forest and it's mitigating turnover in the community. So that was really exciting to have those numbers for the first time. And looking forward, even though the changes are quite modest in lifting condensation level, we can see that there is a trend moving forward to 2070 where we could see the cloud level retreating up the mountainsides. And for those that are essentially left behind by that retreating cloud level, we may predict that we're going to see increasing turnover in the plant community. So that's also very exciting. That's not something that we've been able to do before. But also quite reassuring is that the changes are less than we would have anticipated. So for RCP 4.5, we only have about a 50-metre retreat in the cloud level between now and 2070, which is actually quite modest compared to what it could have been. So even just having this kind of information now means we can start thinking about planning and conservation issues that may face the World Heritage Area moving forward. We haven't been able to do that before. So just to summarise the data from this particular project, our data showed that subtropical rainforest communities were showing evidence of floristic turnover at mid to low elevations. And if that observed community turnover was due to moisture stress, we suspected that perhaps that was being mitigated by cloud water at high altitudes. even modest increases in the lifting condensation level going forward may have significant implications for those species which are dependent on cloud water for up to, or even more perhaps, 40% of their annual moisture budget. And that's especially relevant for those that are located just below the current level of the cloud cap. And reduced water from cloud, especially during dry season, may increase moisture stress beyond the tolerance of some species, resulting in community change. And from the 2019 fire season, we actually found that some of the communities that were previously thought to be quite fire resistant actually ended up succumbing to the bushfires that we've had up here in Queensland. So it's really quite interesting to have a look at potentially the impact that that cloud water might have in helping protect those communities from future bushfires. So just at a more general level, some of the outcomes from the project. We now have an improved understanding of rainfall, evaporation and lifting condensation level projections for the Gondwana World Heritage Rainforest. Now, this is going to allow us, with a little bit more research, to refine our species and community level modelling to try and account for these really significant cloud water inputs. To date, we've not been able to incorporate that large moisture input. Predictions for future habitat and conservation requirements under a changing climate can be refined. And we can incorporate climate change projections into risk assessments, strategic and adaptation planning for the World Heritage Area and other protected areas, and also make more informed, come up with more informed applied management strategies. So just from a personal perspective, we've kind of reached a little bit of a bottleneck in the research that we were doing up here on the potential impacts of cloud water on the forest. But our collaboration via this project has essentially got us through that bottleneck and allowed us now to see a whole new range of projects that we could start to work on. And now we have a range of new collaborators that we can call upon and hopefully do more work together going forward. Thank you very much.
Fabulous. Thank you, Mel and Sugata, for your presentations. Really great to hear that level of detail and presented really well. So we now have time for some questions. We've got just under 15 minutes. We've had a few come in. Just a reminder, do pop any questions you have for Mel and Sugata in the chat box so we can address them now. We might start with one of the first questions that came in. And that's around, I think it's aimed at you, Sugata. The question is from Dr. Little. How can dynamical downscaling capture the local scale weather patterns such as sea breeze or topoclimic variability?
Thank you for the question. That is a good question. And that really drives to the heart of the matter of why we would attempt to use dynamical downscaling in the first place. So if you think about a global climate model, really what you're trying to model there are these massive global scale patterns in circulation. So things like Walker circulation, Hadley circulation, these are things that happen on the scale of larger than continents. So you don't necessarily need to have very fine resolution to resolve that, right? 200 kilometers, 100 kilometers is probably sufficient. When you get to a coastal zone or a mountain range, for example, you have very, very fine scale changes in the climate. You might change your climate every 100 meters, for example. You don't necessarily need to know that to model the entire global circulation. And so those things that are not really needed for the global model, to create a good global model, they really matter for trying to plan for local areas. Dynamical downscaling, what you do is you take those global simulations and you run a much, much higher resolution model. So now we're talking about kilometer resolution, for example, a couple of kilometers. These downscaling projects we had were, I think, 10 kilometers, I believe. Anyway, because you're modeling stuff at a much, much finer resolution, suddenly the things like sea breezes can occur, because if you ever look at a satellite image of an afternoon sea breeze circulation or clouds, they form in a very narrow band on the coast, right? They're not 200 kilometers wide. And so you wouldn't expect a model with 200 kilometers resolution to resolve those things. But if your model resolution is, say, 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers, maybe you will. And so you'll start to see convection or clouds happening on smaller scales. And that's really the reason why you want to go to dynamical downscaling, or you might want to go to dynamical downscaling for some of these types of problems, because if you're on a mountain range that is very steep elevation, well, a global climate model just can't see it. I don't know if that helps with that.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Sugata. We have another question from Mandy asking, was it very easy to transfer the science knowledge between your two disciplines? What were the sort of challenges or highlights that you found from that process? Did you want to maybe start, Sugata?
Yeah, sure. Look, it was an enlightening process for me personally. You know, at the beginning, I felt like Mel and I were speaking almost different languages, which is crazy to say because we're both environmental scientists of a sort and, you know, come from a science background. And, you know, we really had different focuses. So, for example, when it was first described to me what Mel and her colleagues were looking for, I thought, great, this is easy. And I produced some information on 250, 200 kilometer grid scales. Of course, that's not helpful if you're trying to look at habitats and ecological communities that are very, very tightly constrained in space. And so it took a while for us to get there, I think. And I think, I don't know, Mel, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think we both thought that we were speaking the other person's language to start with, but then when we did a deep dive, there was issues of scale, yeah, all sorts of things. But just by going through this process and trying to align our two different sciences and the two different ways we were approaching the question, yeah, I think we've both learned a lot about the two different disciplines and what needs to be done to actually make it relevant to what you're trying to answer.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have another question maybe for you, Mel. Gail asks, is there any progress on using this data to develop different adaptation options? And what changes do you expect? And have you got any thoughts on what sort of interventions or you could try?
Yeah, so essentially neither Sugata or myself are adaptation planners or planners. So we're working on the science, but certainly we're both also very focused on having real world outcomes from what we're producing. So yeah, I think, yeah, particularly up here where we're looking at the impacts of bushfires that have come through some of the World Heritage Area and some of the rainforest communities for the first time. I think it's kind of allowed a little bit of a different perspective and maybe incorporated some things into adaptation planning which are new and potentially issues that we'd just taken for granted before. So yeah, I think the real strength would then be passing this information on to people who are planners and who are focused in the space of adaptation planning, yeah, to use that information going forward.
Fabulous, thanks, Mel. We have another sciencey question, probably for you, Sugata. Sophie asks, were the conclusions that you found in the project the same across simulations from different RCPs?
Yep, thank you for the question. RCPs here stands for Representative Concentration Pathways. So this is really talking about the scenarios of greenhouse gas, scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions pathways going forward into the future. So if you're on a low emissions pathway into the future, the physical changes or the, I guess the practical outcomes are lower, but you still have increased surface warming. So you do have warming and you do have all these effects, but to a lesser degree. I didn't have time to go through that in this presentation because of time constraints. But if anyone's interested to see the range of outcomes according to RCPs, you can see that in the report we've produced for this case study. I think there's a link to it somewhere in the chat.
Thanks, Sugata. Yes, I'll put a link in the chat, but I'll also send a link around when we send you a link to this video recording as well. So keep an eye out for that. Our next question comes from Michael, who asks, how do you think lifting cloud level may impact the system's vulnerability to potential future fires? And Melinda, you already talked about that and you've seen on-ground impacts of that. And Michael also asks, and for the current situation, does moisture from clouds only impact areas which the clouds enter, or do lower latitude systems benefit from the moisture as well?
latitude or altitude?
Altitude,
I'm not sure.
Sorry, altitude, yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so I think, yeah, just to answer that second part, I think because we're encountering the cloud water at the top of the ranges, and then it's going to essentially run down. So I think even areas that are not coming in contact with the cloud water are likely to be quite reliant on it, because, as I was saying, a study that was done to the west of this study region showed that 40%, up to 40% of the moisture that was entering into that system was coming from cloud water. And that wouldn't just be impacting the areas that it's actually coming into contact with, that would also be impacting everything downhill from that as well. So it's a very, very significant moisture input. Sorry, I forgot the first part of the question.
So the first part was around
Fires.
Yes, how do you think the lifting cloud level may impact the system's vulnerability to potential future fires?
Yeah, well, we found from this last fire season that there are areas in Queensland that we never really thought would be vulnerable to fire, that have had fire incursions from the last season. And I know further down into New South Wales, that's probably even been a bigger impact. So it's the conditions that caused the fire incursion into those communities were really quite rare, extremely low humidities and strong winds, and there was very little moisture and humidity in the understory, and it allowed the fires to creep through. But I think moving forward, that's something that we need to think those conditions could occur more often, and communities that we've previously thought were resistant to fire, we probably do really need to consider that there's, under the right conditions or the wrong conditions, there's very little that's going to stand in the way of a fire front.
Yeah, thanks, Mel. It's a
Can I
Sure, Sugata.
Can I jump into that as well, Sonia? Look, it's a good question, how cloud levels may impact system vulnerability to potential future fires. And I just comment that that the risk of fires is highly dynamic, and so there's much more to it than just cloud levels. But if you add up all of these different things that may individually have some small effect, so for example, things like lifting clouds, also things like rising temperatures, changes to evapotranspiration, changes to vegetation and fuel load, all of those things that may all be affected by climate change, in combination may lead to much more severe fire risk in the future. So that's an area of active research, but I just thought I'd make that point that these contributions to moisture stress from lifting cloud levels, while they may seem small, may actually have big impacts when you add them all up together.
Great, thanks, Sugata, for that addition. And Mel, we've had a question come in from Caitlin around your experience, I guess, working in the Gondwana rainforest, and I believe you're out in the rainforest at the moment. Caitlin wants to know, what is it that makes the Gondwana rainforest truly unique, and how do you know that you're in a unique part of the world that's special when you're working on ground there?
To me, it's quite a privilege to work in the World Heritage Area, and it really is a link to a past time in Australia. So the rainforests that you can see represented within the reserves are essentially a time machine back to a past cooler and moister climate, and a much larger part of Australia would have looked like that. So you have very ancient lineages of plants, very ancient lineages of fauna as well. So yeah, for me, it's essentially like working a little time machine, and it's quite precious. And unfortunately, it's something that it may not be assured into the future because of threats from various aspects of climate change. But yeah, go out and get amongst it. It's a very, very special part of the world.
Thanks, Mel. Sounds great. I wish I could be there right now. So we're coming just to the end. I realise there's just one or two questions we haven't got to, but I'll just reiterate that if you do want us to answer the questions we didn't get to, please get in contact with the Hub or myself. We're more than happy to work with Mel and Sugata to get answers to any questions that we weren't able to address today. But that does bring us to the end of this science webinar. So thank you once again to Mel and Sugata for really fantastic presentations. Great to hear all about the case study and the co-production that you've done to produce some really great outcomes. Thank you also to the attendees for your time and for some great questions that have come in. Just a reminder that a recording of today's webinar will be made available on the Hub's website and will also be provided in an email to all attendees, along with the link to the final case study report. If you, like I said, if you have any questions, please get in touch. Also, keep an eye out for information that will be coming via email on the next Earth Systems and Climate Change Science webinar for next month in mid-November, which will be looking at the phenomenon of flash droughts. So that'll be quite an interesting one. So with that, thank you once again for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Earth Systems and Climate Change Hub Science webinar. Thank you.